Military analysts report that Russia is paying a steep price in soldier lives for this offensive. Moscow is employing a brutal strategy dubbed the meat grinder, throwing troops into grueling attrition battles. According to the latest figures, confirmed Russian combat deaths in Ukraine have reached 70,000. Russia persists with this meat grinder approach to weaken Ukrainian forces. However, the casualty numbers cited are drawn solely from public reports, and the actual toll on Russian forces is likely far higher. Currently, Russian units are suffering heavy losses at the front. Frankly, calling it a meat grinder doesn't fully capture the horror of the situation. Ukrainian forces have revived ruthless tactics from ancient Rome, originally designed to disrupt cavalry charges, adapting them to counter relentless Russian infantry assaults. The result is devastating. For every Ukrainian soldier lost, approximately 66 Russian troops are killed. For months, Russia has poured resources into capturing Ukraine's strategic stronghold of Lyman, a town they desperately want to control. Despite sacrificing thousands of soldiers, tanks, and countless artillery rounds, they've made no significant progress, as the main route to Lyman crosses the Zherabets River. Months ago, Russian units managed to cross the river but got pinned down. Ukrainian artillery relentlessly shelled their positions, halting advances and reclaiming what little ground Russia had gained. In desperation, Russian commanders made a risky call. Instead of continuing frontal assaults on Lyman, they shifted south, targeting a small village called Torske. Capturing Torske could open a flanking route to encircle Lyman from behind and cut off its defenders. What Russia didn't anticipate was that Ukraine had predicted this move. Ukraine's 63rd Mechanized Brigade was ready, even eager for this maneuver. For months, they had prepared, setting deadly traps inspired by Roman tactics, combined with precise artillery and modern drone warfare. When Russian forces charged, the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. For every Ukrainian lost, about 66 Russians were killed, an almost unthinkable 66-to-1 casualty ratio in modern warfare. Such numbers are nearly unprecedented. Yet, this is the reality. If Ukraine's tactics weren't brutal enough, the terrain around Lyman and Torske is a nightmare in itself. To the north, large reservoirs and swampy marshlands block Russian attempts to maneuver broadly or flank Ukrainian defenses. Instead, they're funneled into narrow roads, perfect choke points, exactly as Ukraine intended. To the south, dense forests surround Torske. Ukrainian forces exploit these woods for hidden ambushes, sniper nests, and concealed firing positions. They've even dug up roads and created new paths to steer Russians into their traps. One glance at Torske's terrain would tell any seasoned commander it's a death trap. These tactics are rewriting modern warfare's playbook. Are Russian commanders blind to this, or do they simply not care? Either way, by the time they realize their standard approaches are failing, most of their heavy equipment, tanks, and armored vehicles are already destroyed. It's too late to shift the tide. In fact, they've grown even more reckless. With tanks and armored vehicles decimated, their new strategy involves sending waves of infantry on motorcycles and ATVs, hoping speed and chaos will breach lines before Ukraine can react. This only worsens the situation. That's when casualty ratios become almost unbelievable. Remember those Roman traps mentioned earlier? Let's slow down to examine why these small devices, called caltrops, are so brutally effective. A caltrop is a simple weapon with 4 sharp spikes arranged so one always points upward, no matter how it lands. This design is deceptively simple but deadly. Ukraine's 63rd Brigade has scattered thousands of these vicious spikes across dirt roads, forest trails, and narrow paths, targeting routes Russian forces must use. In Roman times, caltrops crippled horses and halted cavalry charges, leaving riders vulnerable to archers and infantry. Brutal then, and just as brutal now.
Ukraine doesn't just mimic Roman tactics, they've upgraded them. Drones drop hundreds of caltrops onto roads and trails seconds before Russian units arrive. Typically, scouts or drones check routes for mines or hazards, but these air-dropped caltrops negate that strategy. A road can appear safe one moment and become an invisible minefield of spikes the next. Russians have no time to react or avoid what they can't see. Best of all, caltrops are cheap and easy to produce. Early in the war, local blacksmiths, often crafting medieval weapons as souvenirs, switched to mass-producing caltrops from welded nails. Unlike traditional mines, caltrops need no explosives and are nearly undetectable by drones or thermal cameras. By the time Russians notice something's wrong, their tires are punctured, motorcycles crash, and soldiers are thrown to the ground, fully exposed to Ukraine's relentless machine gun and sniper fire. To be fair, Russian soldiers ordered into these traps have little choice. In the Russian military, refusing orders often leads to torture, imprisonment, or execution by their own commanders. With leadership like that, their options are grim: get shot by Ukrainians ahead or by their own officers behind. In rare cases, when Russian units briefly seize a forest or frontline position, Ukrainian drones almost immediately spot them. Before these soldiers can catch their breath, let alone dig trenches or fortify, they're hit with drone-dropped grenades, mortars, and artillery from nearby hidden Ukrainian positions. Desperate, Russians have resorted to makeshift thermal cloaks, crude blankets, and coverings to hide body heat from Ukraine's thermal imaging drones. The problem is, these cloaks are so poorly made they backfire, making soldiers stand out more on thermal scans. Facing near-zero survival odds, more Russian troops in the area are choosing surrender over certain death. They know reaching Ukrainian trenches alive is nearly impossible. At this point, surrender is the only rational choice. But why Lyman? Why spend 3 years and countless lives on this seemingly minor town? The truth is, Lyman is central to Russia's eastern campaign. Located on the edge of Donetsk province near Luhansk, Lyman is a critical hub for road and rail networks across the Donbas region. Controlling it means dominating supply lines, troop movements, and deeper advances into eastern Ukraine. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, capturing Lyman became a top priority. Seizing it would pave the way to larger strategic targets like Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, key Donbas cities. Because Lyman sits along a vital river, whoever holds it controls strategic crossing points, offering significant defensive and logistical advantages. Russian forces did capture Lyman in May 2022, but their victory was short-lived. Months later, Ukrainian forces launched a counteroffensive, encircling the Russian garrison and retaking the town on October 1, 2022. This loss was a major humiliation for Russia, especially since it came days after President Putin boldly claimed Donetsk, including Lyman, as Russian territory. Since then, Russia has been obsessed with recapturing Lyman to redeem the defeat and reopen the door to the Donbas. This strategic importance explains why Ukraine is doing everything to hold the town. But caltrops aren't the only ancient trick Ukraine has pulled from history's playbook. Ukrainian troops have laced the area with classic traps like tripwire grenades and hidden mines, reminiscent of guerrilla tactics seen in Vietnam.
Many improvised methods seen in Ukraine today echoed tricks used decades, even centuries ago. Now they're refined and deadlier, blended with modern technology. In the 1960s Vietnam War, Vietnamese guerrillas faced overwhelming US firepower. Instead of direct confrontations, they relied on low-tech but clever traps like sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in pits or camouflaged along trails. Often coated with dirt, poison, or filth, these stakes cause severe infections when piercing soldiers' feet or legs.
Like Ukraine's caltrops today, bamboo stakes were cheap and low-tech. They accounted for about 2% of US combat injuries in Vietnam, but combined with other traps and hidden explosives, they contributed to nearly 15% of total US casualties. The goal wasn't always to kill, but to wound, slow, and demoralize the enemy. An injured soldier often required 2 or more comrades to evacuate, effectively removing multiple fighters from battle with one injury. Soon, US troops grew cautious off cleared paths, knowing the ground could hide spikes or mines. Superior numbers or technology don't always guarantee victory when the enemy fights smarter, leveraging terrain creatively. Russia hasn't learned this, despite decades of similar conflicts.
Ukraine also employs unconventional tactics like deception and decoys with a finesse that would impress ancient strategist Sun Tzu. For example, Ukrainian forces have crafted highly realistic wooden replicas of high-value targets like US-supplied HIMARS rocket launchers, deliberately placed where Russian drones can spot them. As expected, Russia falls for it, wasting costly cruise missiles on worthless decoys. Reports indicate at least 10 Russian cruise missiles have been squandered on these fake targets. Seeing the tactic's success, Ukraine ramped up production of more decoy launchers to keep fooling Russia. If there's one thing Ukraine excels at, it's quickly adapting to what works. When something proves effective, be it kamikaze drones, airdropped caltrops, or fake launchers, Ukraine doubles down, scaling up production and deployment. If something doesn't work, they pivot to test new approaches. In contrast, Russia sticks to its only apparent strategy: bombard an area with artillery, then send waves of infantry charging in, often on foot. When that inevitably fails, their tactical rethink isn't a new approach, but moving those soldiers faster, using motorcycles, ATVs, or throwing more men into the meat grinder. You'd expect a military from a global power, especially one with Russia's history, to show some creativity or adaptability under pressure. So why does Russia struggle to improvise or adapt? It boils down to military culture. The Russian army is notorious for its rigid, top-down command structure. Unlike Western militaries, where sergeants and junior officers are encouraged to think independently and adapt to changing conditions, Russian units often need approval from higher-ups for even minor tactical shifts. If something unexpected happens, say your convoy runs into thousands of invisible spikes, your instinct as a Russian soldier is to retreat, find a safer route, or send scouts ahead. But in Russia's military, you often don't have that option. Instead, you're stuck waiting for new orders from above. By the time those arrive, your unit may have suffered catastrophic losses. Another issue is Russia's military mindset, which prioritizes sheer numbers and brute force over smart tactics or finesse. Even in 1912, the Imperial Russian Army's general staff taught just 2 maneuvers: advance or retreat, often massing troops in dense columns to charge enemy lines, regardless of devastating artillery losses. In World War II, Soviet commanders often outmatched German forces through sheer numerical superiority, accepting horrific losses as part of the process. Sadly, this brute force mentality hasn't changed much today. Look at Russia's fight for Bakhmut.
They spent 9 grueling months and tens of thousands of lives to capture one city. The same pattern plays out at dozens of other strategic locations across Ukraine. Not every battle sees the extreme 66-1 casualty ratio observed around Torsk, but even 10-1 or 5-1 ratios are devastating. In war, the attacking side almost always suffers heavier losses than the defender. That's just how it works. Military strategists know this, which is why textbooks recommend at least a 3-1 attacker-to-defender ratio to have a chance at breaking through. For a guaranteed success, that ratio rises to 4-1 or higher. Defenders choose the battlefield, fortify positions, dig trenches, and set ambushes, shaping the fight to their advantage. Attackers, meanwhile, advance through open terrain, exposed and vulnerable to enemy fire. This is why a successful assault demands meticulous planning, careful strategy, and constant adaptation on the ground. Every barrage, infantry push, and recon mission must have a clear purpose. Russian commanders simply aren't doing this. That's why the outcomes are predictably horrific. No matter how large your army, losing 5, 10, or even dozens of soldiers for every enemy casualty isn't just unsustainable, it eventually cripples your force. Unless Russia counters Ukraine's innovative defenses with new tactics or deploys vastly greater overwhelming force, they'll hit a tipping point. This is the breaking point where an army can no longer advance and struggles to hold captured ground as its fighting strength is brutally drained. Many analysts believe Russia is dangerously close to this critical threshold. This isn't just at Bakhmut or Lyman. Russian forces face similar issues in the south and north. In the south, Ukraine's summer counteroffensive is gaining momentum. By late July, Ukrainian forces retook a key village, Staromayorsk, in Donetsk province. It may seem minor on a map, but Staromayorsk sits along the Mokry Yali River, a vital piece of Russia's first defensive line, especially where Donetsk meets Zaporizhia province. For some reason, Russia didn't prepare seriously until Ukraine openly announced its plans. Was it sheer negligence or pressure from above? When Russia finally acted, they built some of Europe's most formidable defenses since World War II. Vast trench networks, fortified bunkers, concrete tank traps, and dense, deadly minefields, backed by superior artillery and air support. In theory, these fortifications should have stopped Ukraine cold. Yet, despite everything Russia throws at them, Ukrainian forces are steadily breaking through, reclaiming villages one by one. By late July, they had liberated at least 14 villages across Donetsk and Zaporizhia provinces. Meanwhile, far to the north, along the 620-mile front line, Russia launched its own offensive, particularly in Kharkiv province around Kupiansk, a critical rail hub Ukraine liberated last fall. In August, Ukrainian intelligence warned that over 100,000 Russian troops, along with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, had massed in the Kupiansk-Lyman area, preparing for a potential major push. By mid-August, Russia intensified its assaults, forcing Ukraine into fierce defensive battles. Authorities ordered the evacuation of 37 settlements in Kupiansk province, including the mandatory relocation of thousands of civilians from villages near the front. These evacuations were driven by both civilian safety amid escalating shelling and the need to give Ukrainian forces operational freedom without endangering innocent lives. Leading Russia's push are Storm Z units, largely recruited from prisons and thrown into frontline assaults. Supported by tanks, attack helicopters, and heavy artillery, these units have repeatedly tried to breach Ukrainian lines along the Ust-Kil River and retake ground near Kupiansk. But, as elsewhere,
Despite Russia's massive force buildup and aggressive pushes, they've achieved no real breakthrough. Some frontline villages have changed hands multiple times in a single day. A trench or tree line taken by Russia at dawn may be back under Ukrainian control by dusk. After nearly 4 years of war, almost 1 million casualties, and countless destroyed vehicles, Russia remains trapped in a cycle of failure. The question isn't just how long they can sustain this, but how many more losses they can endure before realizing that overwhelming numbers and brute force can't subdue a nation fighting smarter, tougher, and with more resolve than they ever imagined.